Hello and welcome to Newcentre. With me, Parikshit Luthra. The recent visit of US Speaker for the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan has increased tensions between the United States and China. The PLA has conducted live fire drills in the Taiwan Strait. Many world leaders, most recently the Singapore Foreign Minister, has expressed worry that there is a very real risk of tension spiraling into a war. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has looked at US-China relations in his latest book, The Avoidable War. Speaking to CNBC-TV18, he said there was a clear analogy with South China Sea and Taiwan to India-China LAC dispute. I began by asking him about the current status of US-China tensions and their impact on geopolitics.
Well, as someone who's looked at this relationship between the US and China over the last 40 years, since I was a student at the Australian National University studying Chinese way back then, I would say that the state of the relationship now is the worst it's been in half a century. Going back to the days when Nixon and Kissinger first went to Beijing in order to build the modern US-China relationship way back then. And since then, of course, China has become more powerful. China now has a new assertive leader pursuing a more assertive foreign and security policy. And now the United States, at least 2017, has been responding with a new doctrine of strategic competition. Put all those factors together, what we end up with is a relationship which is now sharp strategically, and whereas there is no immediate prospect of crisis, conflict and war, it has moved from being a remote possibility to becoming much more of a possibility. And that's why markets and everyone else are concerned, because suddenly geopolitical risk goes from the margins to the center.
Right. We have seen growing tensions between Taiwan and China recently, military drills by both countries. What is the likelihood of a full-blown conflict or a limited conflict? And in case there is one, what will be the impact on the global economy and global tensions?
It's important to understand Chinese thinking on this because it goes to the question of timetables. I think if you look at all the evidence, China under Xi Jinping is not predisposed towards an attack on Taiwan now. China still has a lot by way of military preparations to make, and furthermore, financial and economic preparations. They've seen the impact of collective economic and financial sanctions against Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, in my judgment, we're more likely to see the possibility of a Chinese initiative militarily against Taiwan in the late 20s and early 30s. That does not rule out the possibility of conflict by accident between now and then through a major incident occurring, a ship going down, a plane being taken out, etc. But I think these factors will increasingly weigh upon the mind of those calculating aggregate geopolitical risk for the 7 to 10 years ahead.
What do you think would be the extent of US involvement if there were to be a conflict in Taiwan?
Well, this is the $6,000 question. None of us know the answer to it. But there are a spectrum of possibilities. The threshold question is, would the US militarily intervene? Given their historical doctrine of strategic ambiguity, it would be an open question. Furthermore, it would depend, in my judgment, on the circumstances which gave rise to the conflict in the first place. And if, however, it was a direct Chinese military assault on Taiwan, any American president, in my judgment, would find it difficult to sit idly by and simply to sit on their hands. So then it becomes a question of the form of engagement, whether it's Ukrainian style, that is simply the supply of military arms and equipment, or whether it is active air support, active naval support, or in an extreme scenario, ground support. I expect it will be somewhere across that spectrum, but I think it will depend very much on the circumstances of the time and the extent to which the American body politic conclude that China has been demonstrably aggressive.
Right. India's border tensions with China. This has been a dispute that has been festering for decades now. It worsened 2 years ago with the Galwan clashes in which 20 Indian soldiers, 5 Chinese soldiers were killed. The deployment in eastern Ladakh is at its peak. The numbers haven't come down. The both sides are not pulling back. Do you see this getting resolved anyhow in some way or the other?
I think all the evidence points in the reverse direction at this time. You have, of course, Chinese actions on the border most recently, most spectacularly in the events of April, May of 2020. But since then, you also have a pattern whereby China has decided to dig in behind that line with new infrastructure, new road construction, new airfield construction. This would tend to point in the direction that China is not in the business of, as it were, de-escalating or withdrawing. For those reasons, it seems to be trended in one direction, which we see evidenced in Chinese patterns of behavior in the South China Sea, to some extent over Taiwan and the East China Sea, which is incrementally changing the circumstances on the ground, or on the sea, as it were. For the long-term future, never rule out the possibility that Xi Jinping may ultimately decide to play a grand card and say, here's a deal on the border, in order to rewrite the total geostrategic map. Beijing, Delhi, Moscow, a new, as it were, strategic triangle or strategic economic triangle. But that is something which is not supported by the evidence right now.
Right. We've also seen President Xi strengthening his position, strengthening his control over the Chinese political setup. You've also written that he is likely to continue in power till 2037. What are going to be the consequences for India in these circumstances?
Well, Xi Jinping...
do you expect him to be more assertive, more aggressive towards India, as they see India as the largest challenger in the region?
Well, if you look carefully at Xi Jinping, and I've made something of a study of Xi Jinping's worldview. In fact, I've just completed a 4-year research project at Oxford on this very subject. Xi Jinping's overwhelming predisposition as a leader is to change the status quo. It is to move the strategic engagement towards China's advantage. Therefore, as I said before, what we've seen in the evidence so far is China changing the strategic circumstances on the ground. That is more likely to accelerate in the future as Xi Jinping concludes that he is more powerful. Of course, one of the militating factors against that is the actions of the government of India, but also its Quad partners, in the case of the United States, Japan, and Australia, and the extent to which this begins to constitute a more effective rebalancing of the overall strategic balance in relation to China.
So that is something we will see evolving in the years to come. What playbook could China deploy in order to strain India's resources, both economically and militarily, in the years to come?
Well, China...
Because everything doesn't have to be a straight-on, full-blown conflict. The Chinese government can utilize tools to keep draining India's resources.
Well, if you read carefully the Chinese military classics, and there are 7 military classics which go back to ancient times. One of the great Chinese axioms is to secure strategic victory without firing a shot. And I think it's important for us to understand that from China's perspective, actual armed conflict is the last move in extremis, and only when China is absolutely confident of its military circumstances on the ground. To quote one of those military classics, for example, Sun Tzu's Art of War, the first paragraph says, "War is a great matter of state. If you lose the war, you lose the state." So this weighs heavily on Chinese thinking. Applied to India, therefore, you have multiple lines across which India is, shall we say, engaged directly or indirectly with China. The border we've just spoken about in all of its subcomponents. Then you have Kashmir. Then you have, of course, Pakistan itself, which is China's all-weather ally and has been for many, many years. And then, of course, you have China's increased operations in India's maritime space, both Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with Pakistan, to some extent with Iran, and China's new naval base in Djibouti, and prospectively in East Africa. So for those reasons, you have multiple points of intersection with India's core national interests.
I'd also like to ask you, recently there have been calls to confer the Bharat Ratna on the Dalai Lama. Do you think that could create more tensions, more flashpoints between India and China?
Well, these decisions are a sovereign matter for India itself. I'm enormously respectful respectful towards His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I've met him several times in my life. Certainly from Beijing's perspective, this is a highly sensitive matter, which is once the Dalai Lama passes away, who replaces him and how is that done? Because this goes to China's core strategic concern, which is the level of its sovereignty and control over Tibet, which is fundamental from the lens on the world as seen from Beijing. But I'm sure our friends in Delhi who run the government will be very mindful of all these factors when they reach their decisions on these matters.
Right. But you do feel that Eastern Ladakh may not be the only one. China would look for opportunities to open more flashpoints in different parts of the country?
Well, Chinese strategy ebbs and flows depending on the strategic circumstances. Take, for example, the relationship between China and Japan. You have massive Chinese, shall we say, pressures on Senkaku Diaoyudao in the East China Sea on a daily basis. It ebbs and it flows, and so does China's diplomacy towards Tokyo. It ebbs and it flows. Similarly in the South China Sea, and carrots and sticks with Taiwan from time to time, even in China's bilateral relationship with Australia. So I think we've all become used to these different patterns of Chinese behaviour. The importance for us all is to keep chatting with one another, working our way through these challenges. But what I've learnt in my long dealings with our Chinese friends is as follows. China respects strength and is contemptuous of weakness. China respects consistency and is contemptuous of changeability. And China also expects to deal with governments over time across the electoral cycles as well.
My final two questions, sir. China has been increasing its involvement in India's neighbourhood, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. What should India be watching out for in the region?
Well, India, of course, has faced these strategic challenges over many decades. The border war with China in 1962 effectively rewrote India's aggregate strategic circumstances. I think where India is going in the way in which it seeks to rebalance its overall relationship with China, certainly during Prime Minister Modi's period, has been increasingly to deepen the strategic partnership with the United States. And this, of course, is not simply an abstraction. It goes down to the hardcore business of military equipment, comes down to the hardcore business of military exercising with each other. It comes down to the business of foreign policy collaboration and coordination with each other, and also where the next frontier of this overall, shall we say, strategic engagement goes between China and the democratic world will be on the key question of technology, as that will reshape the balance of power for all of us.
Right. My final question, India and Australia have already finalized an interim trade deal. They're now working towards an FTA. Talks will begin very soon. What, according to you, is the potential of such an agreement? And considering China is the common challenge between India and Australia right now, key areas where the two countries should work together?
Well, we should look to analogies from cricket because we both understand cricket very well. And therefore we've got to make sure we've got a sharp bowling team and we've got a sharp batting team. And we also keep our eyes on the field as well. The bottom line is trade and commerce and mutual investment is what brings life and vitality to the overall relationship. And if you look at the numbers, they're increasing all the time. It's been a slow business. I launched the first feasibility study into an India-Australia FTA way back in the Mesolithic period when I was Prime Minister of Australia. It's quite a while ago. So I'm looking forward to this being finally done and dusted, as I look forward to India engaging in parallel free trade agreements with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, and ultimately I'd like to see it with the United States, because this mutual economic opportunity for us all should not be seen through the lens of how will it affect my business or my industry, but look through the lens of what grows all of our economies across the democratic world.
All right, so that was Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, speaking to CNBC-TV18. On that note, we take a short break. When we return, we'll get you a special report on the 40 years of Maruti Suzuki and two biggest voices from the automotive industry, Shashank Srivastava of Maruti Suzuki and Vivek Chand Sehgal of Samvardhana Motherson International Limited. Don't go anywhere.